The voting chamber fell silent as Warlord Raktos slammed his 4 fists against the marble table. Purple veins bulged across his scaled neck, while representatives from 40 different species watched in stunned horror. This was supposed to be a routine territorial dispute hearing, the kind that got resolved through economic sanctions or trade negotiations. Nobody expected what came next. Enough of this talking, Raktos growled, his voice like grinding stone. He stood nearly 9 feet tall, his armored body blocking the light from 3 different suns streaming through the chamber windows. The Draknor Empire claims Frontier World 7 by right of conquest. Your pathetic council can debate for years while my people already control the surface. Ambassador Patricia Mills felt her stomach drop. 12,000 human colonists lived on that world. Farmers, teachers, engineers, families who had spent 5 years building homes under open skies after Earth's crowded cities. Her hands gripped the edge of her seat. The Galactic Compact forbids military seizure of settled worlds, the Yithrin Chancellor said carefully. The elderly being's skin had gone pale gray with stress. You must withdraw your forces immediately or face sanctions. Raktos laughed, a sound like breaking bones. Sanctions? The Draknor Empire has endured worse, but I will offer you weak creatures something better. He reached into his armor and pulled out an ancient data crystal, placing it on the table with deliberate care. I invoke the trial by champion. The chamber erupted. Representatives jumped to their feet, voices overlapping in a dozen languages. Patricia had been a diplomat for 20 years, and she had never seen such chaos in council chambers. She grabbed her aide's arm. What is he talking about? She demanded. Her aide, a young man named Roger, was frantically scrolling through his tablet. His face had gone white. It's real. Section 47 of the Founder Compact. When 2 civilizations dispute territory, either side can demand single combat between champions. Winner takes the disputed land. That's insane. When was this last used? 812 years ago. Patricia felt dizzy. This couldn't be happening. She watched as the Chancellor examined the crystal with shaking hands, plugging it into the chamber's main display. Ancient text appeared, written in the formal script of the founder species, who had created the Galactic Council 3,000 years ago. The translation was clear enough. The law is valid, the Chancellor announced, and the chamber fell silent again. Warlord Raktos has formally invoked trial by champion. Humanity has 10 standard days to provide a champion to face him in single combat, or forfeit all claims to Frontier World 7. Raktos grinned, showing rows of serrated teeth. I have killed 47 champions from various species across my lifetime. Hethrons, Kelmar, even a Vraxian warform. He flexed his 4 arms, each one thick with muscle and ending in claws that could shred steel. Send me your greatest warrior, humans. Let us see if your species has any courage at all. Patricia stood on shaking legs. This is barbaric. We're a civilized society, not medieval savages who settle disputes with violence. Then surrender the world, Raktos said simply. I will be merciful. Your colonists will become workers in our mines. They will be fed and sheltered. Most will survive, most. The word hung in the air like poison. Patricia thought of the colony's children, playing in the settlement's central plaza where she had visited last year during the founding anniversary celebration. A little girl had given her a flower crown made from native plants. Humanity will respond within the required time frame, Patricia said, her voice steady despite the terror in her chest. That night she sent urgent messages to Earth Command. The response came in fragmented pieces over the next 3 days. Military analysts confirmed what she already knew. Even Earth's best Special Forces soldiers couldn't defeat Raktos in hand-to-hand combat. The Draknor species had evolved on a heavy-gravity world. Their bones were 3 times denser than human bones. They had redundant organs, natural armor plating, and reaction speeds that made them perfect killers. Recommend diplomatic solution, the final message read. Cannot provide suitable champion. Begin evacuation protocols for Frontier World 7. Patricia sat alone in her quarters, staring at that message until the words blurred. 12,000 people gone, enslaved, she had failed them. Then her personal comm chimed. A priority message from Earth, but not from Command. The sender ID read simply, Cultural Affairs Division, champion en route. Arrival in 6 hours. 6 hours later, Patricia stood in the docking bay with Roger and 3 security officers. They watched as a small transport ship connected to the airlock. The door opened and a man stepped through carrying a worn leather case and a backpack. He was not what she expected. Patricia had imagined a soldier, someone young and hard with scars and military bearing. Instead, she saw a man in his 50s with gray threading through his dark hair. He wore simple civilian clothes and glasses. He moved like someone who spent most of his time in libraries, not battlefields. "Ambassador Mills?" he said, extending a hand. "Daniel Cross, I'm your champion." Patricia shook his hand automatically, her mind refusing to process this. There must be some mistake. Command said they couldn't send anyone. They couldn't, Daniel agreed. He set down his case and rolled his shoulders, wincing slightly. "Long flight. I volunteered through the Cultural Affairs Office instead." "They approved it. Volunteered? Mr. Cross, do you understand what you're agreeing to?" "Rakdos has killed 47 opponents. He's 9 feet tall with natural weapons that can tear through combat armor. I know what he is." Daniel's voice was calm, almost gentle. "I've read the complete file on Draknor physiology and combat doctrine." "Then you know this is suicide." Daniel smiled slightly. "Maybe, but I have a granddaughter in that colony. Her name is Annie. She's 7 years old and she likes to collect rocks from the stream bed near their farm." He picked up his case again. "So yes, Ambassador. I understand perfectly well what I'm agreeing to." Roger had been silent until now, but he finally spoke up. "Mr. Cross, what exactly do you do? What's your background?" "I'm a historian," Daniel said. "I specialize in medieval European warfare. I teach martial arts reconstruction at a university back on Earth. For the last 30 years, I've been studying how people fought before we had guns or energy weapons." Patricia felt her last hope die. Earth had sent them a teacher, an academic, a man whose combat experience consisted of historical demonstrations and academic papers. They were going to watch him die in an arena while the galaxy bore witness to humanity's weakness. "I need to see the complete text of the trial by champion law," Daniel said. "Every word in the original language if possible, and I'll need access to a workshop. I have to build something." "Build what?" Patricia asked. Daniel opened his leather case. Inside, carefully wrapped in cloth, lay pieces of dark wood, metal components, and what looked like steel cable. "My weapon," he said. "If old rules apply, then the oldest rules apply. And humans have been killing things much bigger than ourselves for a very long time." He looked up at Patricia, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that made her pause. Not bravado or foolish courage, just a quiet, absolute certainty. "Trust me, Ambassador. I know what I'm doing." Patricia wanted to believe him. She wanted to think that Earth hadn't sent a man to die for nothing. But all she could see was a middle-aged teacher with a box of antiques, standing between 12,000 human lives and a warlord who had never lost. "I'll get you the legal documents," she said quietly. "And the workshop access, Mr. Cross. I hope you're right." Daniel nodded and picked up his case. As he walked away toward the quarters Roger was leading him to, Patricia heard him whisper something under his breath. "Just like the practice range. Just like the practice range." She didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. Daniel spent the first 12 hours in his assigned quarters reading legal documents that nobody had examined carefully in over 8 centuries. Ambassador Mills had delivered everything he requested, probably thinking it wouldn't matter anyway. The original founder text appeared on his tablet in flowing script that his translation software struggled to parse properly. He made notes in an old-fashioned paper notebook, the kind that made younger colleagues smile at his outdated habits. But Daniel had learned long ago that writing things by hand helped him think. His handwriting filled page after page with observations, questions, and connections that others had missed. The trial by champion law was exactly what Rakdos claimed. 2 civilizations in dispute could resolve their conflict through single combat between chosen representatives. The winner species gained the contested territory. Both champions had to agree to fight to death or surrender. Simple, brutal, effective. But the law was written during the founder era, when most spacefaring species were just beginning to explore beyond their home systems. The specific language mattered more than anyone realized. Daniel underlined 3 phrases in his notebook: personal combat, traditional arms, and cultural heritage weapons. Traditional. That single word was the key that everyone else had missed. For the Draknor species, traditional meant claws, natural weapons, perhaps ceremonial blades forged in the way their ancestors had made them. For humanity, though, the definition could stretch back much further. How far back did human tradition go? 1,000 years? 10,000? Humans had been making weapons since before they built permanent settlements. He pulled up his personal files, decades of research on medieval and ancient warfare. Images of longbows, crossbows, siege engines, and hand weapons filled his screen. His doctoral dissertation had focused on the development of armor-piercing projectile weapons in 14th century Europe. He had spent 30 years teaching people how to use these weapons properly, not as toys or curiosities, but as the lethal tools they had been designed to be. A crossbow could punch through steel plate armor at 50 meters. Medieval soldiers had considered them so effective that religious authorities tried to ban their use. The weapon was simple physics, mechanical advantage storing enormous energy, released in an instant to drive a bolt through whatever stood in its way. Daniel had built dozens of crossbows for historical accuracy competitions. He had shot them thousands of times. He knew their capabilities better than he knew most modern technology. The question was whether the Galactic Council would accept it. He found Ambassador Mills in her office early the next morning. She looked like she hadn't slept. Dark circles under her eyes as she reviewed supply manifests for the colony evacuation that everyone assumed would be necessary. "I need to speak with the Ythran Chancellor," Daniel said. Patricia looked up, surprised. "The Chancellor?" "Daniel, he's one of the most senior officials in the entire council. I can't just arrange a meeting because you want to discuss legal theory." "It's not theory. It's about what weapon I can use in the trial." She set down her tablet. "What weapon?" "You brought pieces of wood and metal cable. Unless you're planning to strangle Rakdos with it, I don't see how." "I'm building a crossbow," Daniel interrupted. "A proper war crossbow, the kind that English and French armies used during the 100 Years' War. 200-pound draw weight, steel-tipped bolts, effective range of 80 meters. It was designed specifically to kill armored opponents." Patricia stared at him. "You want to bring a medieval weapon to fight an alien warlord." "I want to bring a human traditional weapon to a trial that explicitly permits traditional arms," Daniel corrected. "But I need official confirmation that it's legal under the rules. That's why I need to speak with the Chancellor." To her credit, Patricia didn't argue further. Maybe she had decided that a man volunteering to die earned the right to choose his own weapon. Maybe she was simply too exhausted to fight. Either way, she arranged the meeting. The Ythran Chancellor received them in a private chamber lined with books and data crystals. The elderly being studied Daniel with large, dark eyes that held intelligence refined over 2 centuries of life. "Ambassador Mills explains you have questions about permitted weapons in the upcoming trial," the Chancellor said. His voice had a musical quality that translation software rendered into something almost hypnotic. Daniel placed his tablet on the table between them, displaying the relevant legal text. "The law permits traditional arms consistent with each species' cultural heritage. I want to confirm that a crossbow qualifies as a traditional human weapon." The Chancellor's skin shifted to a thoughtful blue color. "A crossbow. I am not familiar with this weapon. It's a mechanical projectile launcher," Daniel explained. He pulled up images and technical diagrams. "Humans developed it over 2,000 years ago. We used it extensively in warfare for nearly 1,000 years. It was specifically designed to penetrate armor and kill at range. In 1139, the Pope tried to ban its use in warfare between Christians because it was considered too deadly. A religious authority attempted to prohibit a weapon. Yes, it failed because the weapon was too effective to abandon. Crossbows allowed common soldiers to kill armored knights who had trained for warfare their entire lives. It was the great equalizer." The Chancellor studied the images carefully. "This is not an energy weapon. It uses no power source beyond the user's physical strength to draw the string." "Correct. It's pure mechanical energy storage and release. The draw weight determines the power. Historical war crossbows ranged from 150 to 300 pounds of draw force." "And you believe this falls within the legal definition of traditional arms?" Daniel leaned forward. "Chancellor, with respect, I know it does. The law was written to allow each species to use weapons from their cultural military heritage. The Draknor can use their claws and ceremonial blades. Humans can use weapons from our documented history. The crossbow is as traditional to humans as claws are to Draknor." The Chancellor was quiet for a long moment. His skin shifted through several colors that the translation software couldn't interpret. Finally, he spoke. "You present a compelling argument, Professor Cross. Yes, I was informed of your academic credentials. The Chancellor's eyes held something that might have been approval. I have consulted the original founder texts. Nothing in the law specifies a time limit on what constitutes traditional. If the weapon exists in your species' documented military history and requires no modern power sources, it qualifies. Daniel felt tension he didn't know he was carrying released from his shoulders. Thank you, Chancellor. However, I must ask, the Chancellor continued, do you truly believe this weapon can defeat Warlord Rakdos? He has killed 47 opponents. He is a perfect example of Draknor evolution. Dense bones, redundant organs, natural armor that can deflect most bladed weapons. I don't believe it, Chancellor. I know it. Humans didn't develop the crossbow to hunt animals. We developed it to kill other humans wearing the best armor our civilization could produce. Rakdos is big, strong, and armored, but he's never faced an opponent who can hit him from 80 meters away with enough force to drive a steel bolt through his body. The Chancellor's skin rippled with a color Daniel's translator labeled as respect. Then, I wish you fortune, Professor. The official ruling will state that your weapon is legally permitted under trial by champion protocols. Word spread quickly through the station. Daniel had been granted permission to use a primitive projectile weapon in the upcoming combat. The news reached Draknor observers within hours. Rakdos summoned his advisors to discuss this development. They gathered in the Draknor vessel docked at the station, a warship that made the human diplomatic ship look like a child's toy. The human plans to use what? Rakdos demanded. His chief advisor, a scarred veteran named Greth, pulled up translated information. It's called a crossbow, an ancient mechanical device that launches small projectiles. Our intelligence shows it was common in human warfare approximately 1,000 years before they achieved spaceflight. Rakdos laughed. 1,000-year-old weapon? Is this meant to be an insult? I believe it's meant to be all they have, another advisor said. The human champion is not a soldier. He's an academic who studies ancient warfare. He has no military combat experience. Then why did Earth send him? Greth hesitated. Our sources indicate he volunteered. He has family in the colony. Rakdos fell silent. That changed things slightly. A volunteer fighting for family was different from a conscript sent to die. There was honor in that, at least. Show me this crossbow weapon, he commanded. The display showed historical images of humans using crossbows in various contexts. Hunting, warfare, sport competitions. Rakdos studied them carefully. The weapons looked crude, simple mechanisms of wood and metal. The projectiles were small, barely larger than his smallest claw. These are supposed to frighten me? He asked. But one of his advisors, an elder warrior named Shoth, leaned closer to the display. His eyes narrowed as he examined the technical specifications that human databases freely provided. My lord, Shoth said carefully, these weapons were designed to penetrate metal armor. This diagram shows the bolt completely piercing steel plates that human soldiers wore in battle. Human steel, Rakdos dismissed. Not Draknor armor. No, my lord. But the principle concerns me. This is not a weapon meant for hunting prey. It was built specifically to kill armored warriors, and these historical records show it was very effective at that purpose. Rakdos waved a hand dismissively. You worry too much, old friend. What can an academic with an ancient weapon do against me? I have faced Vraxian war forms and defeated them. This human is barely larger than a child by our standards. Shoth bowed his head in acceptance, but Daniel noticed he didn't look convinced. I want to observe the human's preparations, Rakdos decided. If he's building this weapon here, I want to see what it can actually do. That was permitted under the trial rules. Both champions could observe each other's preparations, though actual interaction was forbidden until the combat itself. 2 days later, Rakdos and his guards stood in the observation gallery above the workshop Daniel had been assigned. Below, the human worked with careful precision, assembling his weapon from components he had fabricated using the station's manufacturing equipment. Daniel was building what was called a windlass crossbow, a heavy siege weapon that required a mechanical crank to draw the string. The bow itself was made from laminated composite materials, modern versions of the yew wood and horn that medieval craftsmen had used, but with better performance characteristics. Rakdos watched as Daniel carefully tested the draw weight, making small adjustments to the trigger mechanism. The human moved with the careful attention of someone who had done this many times before. He's too old, one of Rakdos's guards muttered. Look at the gray in his hair. He should be teaching children, not fighting warriors. But Raktos said nothing. He was watching Daniel's hands, the way they moved with absolute certainty across the weapon's surface. This was not a man playing with a toy. This was a craftsman building a tool he understood completely. Daniel loaded a bolt into the crossbow, a metal shaft tipped with a narrow armor-piercing point. He aimed at a test target 50 meters away, a thick sheet of composite material similar to what many species used for body armor. The crossbow released with a mechanical snap that echoed through the workshop. The bolt crossed the distance so fast it was barely visible. It struck the target dead center and punched completely through, embedding itself in the wall behind. Raktos felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not fear, he had never known fear. But perhaps for the first time in many years, uncertainty. Below in the workshop, Daniel examined the test shot, made one small adjustment to the sight mechanism and nodded to himself. Just like the practice range, he said quietly. 3 days until the trial. The arena was older than most civilizations currently active in the galaxy. Built on a neutral moon by species whose names had been forgotten millennia ago, it served as a place where disputes could be settled when words failed. The floor was smooth stone worn down by countless feet, forming a perfect circle 100 meters across. Rising tiers of seating surrounded the combat ground, currently filled with 40,000 spectators representing dozens of species who had traveled here to witness something that hadn't happened in 800 years, millions. More watched through holographic transmission across the galaxy. Patricia stood in the council observation box, her hands gripping the railing so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Roger stood beside her, his face pale as he watched the arena prepare for combat. Around them, representatives from other species murmured to each other in languages that the translation software rendered into a low, anxious buzz. "This is barbaric," a Kelmar representative said, her fur bristling with agitation. "We should have prevented this somehow." "The law is clear," the Yithran chancellor replied from his seat. Both parties agreed. "We can only observe now." Patricia wanted to scream at them all. This wasn't some abstract legal exercise. This was Daniel, who had spent the last 3 days quietly building his weapon and practicing in the workshop. Daniel, who had shown her pictures of his granddaughter and talked about teaching her to identify different types of rocks. Daniel, who was about to die while the galaxy watched. A horn sounded deep and resonant. The arena gates opened on the eastern side. Warlord Raktos entered to a roar from the Draknor section of the crowd. He wore ceremonial armor polished to a mirror shine, plates of dark metal covering his chest and shoulders. His forearms were bare, showing the thick scales and corded muscle beneath. In his upper right hand he carried a serrated blade as long as Patricia's arm. In his lower left a spiked gauntlet that looked like it could crush stone. Raktos walked to the center of the arena, and the ground genuinely trembled under his footsteps. 9 feet of pure predator evolution, refined through millions of years of survival on a world where only the strongest lived to breed. His roar shook the air, a challenge that needed no translation. The crowd fell silent. The western gate opened. Daniel emerged, and Patricia heard gasps from multiple species in the observation box. The contrast was almost cruel. Where Raktos was massive and armored, Daniel looked small and vulnerable. He wore reproduction medieval armor, a brigandine coat made of canvas with steel plates riveted between the layers. It offered protection while allowing movement, the kind that archers and crossbowmen had worn in the 14th century. He carried the crossbow in both hands, already loaded. A quiver hung at his hip, holding 11 more bolts. He walked with steady steps toward the center of the arena, his face calm behind the glasses he still wore. "Is that all the armor he has?" Roger whispered. "That thin coat?" Patricia couldn't answer. Her throat had closed up completely. The referee, an ancient Yithran judge even older than the chancellor, stood between the two combatants. His voice carried through the arena's amplification system. "This trial is conducted under the authority of the Founder Compact Section 47. Both champions have agreed to participate. The combat will continue until one champion is dead or surrenders verbally. No outside interference is permitted. Any violation will result in immediate forfeiture." The judge looked at both combatants. "Do you both understand and accept these terms?" "I accept," Raktos said, his voice carrying easily. "I accept," Daniel replied, his voice quieter but steady. The judge nodded and backed away toward the edge of the arena. When the horn sounds, combat begins. Warriors, take your positions. Raktos and Daniel separated, walking to opposite sides of the arena's center circle. Raktos faced Daniel, rolling his shoulders and flexing all four arms. He began to speak, his voice projected for the crowd. I will make this quick, human. You have courage to face me, though you will die for it. Your species should remember you with honor. Daniel didn't respond. He was checking the crossbow, running his hands over the mechanism in a final inspection. He tested the sight alignment, adjusted his grip slightly, and then looked up at Raktos. Raktos tilted his head. You don't even speak? No final words? No declaration for your people? Daniel's response was quiet, probably not meant to carry beyond the arena floor, but the amplification system picked it up anyway. I don't talk during work. Raktos blinked, then threw his head back and laughed. Good, at least you take this seriously. He dropped into a combat stance, his forearms spread wide, claws extended. Come then, human. Show me what your ancient weapon can do. The horn sounded. Raktos exploded forward with terrifying speed. For something so large, he moved like lightning, closing 20 meters in seconds. His legs drove against the stone floor with enough force to crack it, each stride eating up distance. He came straight at Daniel. No strategy or tactics, just raw, overwhelming aggression that had killed 47 opponents before. The crowd roared. The Draknor section was on their feet, screaming encouragement. Patricia felt her heart stop completely. Daniel didn't run. He didn't dodge or try to create distance. He just raised the crossbow in one smooth motion, sighted down its length and squeezed the trigger. The crossbow released with a mechanical snap that somehow cut through all the noise in the arena. The bolt flew across 30 meters in less than a quarter of a second, a blur of metal moving at nearly 400 feet per second. It hit Raktos in the upper right shoulder, just above where his ceremonial armor ended. The Warlord's charge stopped as if he had hit an invisible wall. He staggered, his roar of challenge turning into a bellow of shock and pain. The bolt had punched completely through his shoulder, through the scale armor that could deflect knife blades, through muscle that was denser than human muscle by a factor of 3. The steel tip emerged from his back, covered in purple Draknor blood. Raktos looked down at the wound in disbelief. His upper right arm hung useless, the shoulder joint destroyed. Purple blood ran down his chest, stark against the polished armor. The arena went absolutely silent. Patricia realized she had stopped breathing. Around her, other ambassadors stared in shock at what they had just witnessed. The Kelmar representative's fur had gone flat against her skin. The Chancellor's color had shifted to something the translator labeled as profound surprise. Daniel was already reloading. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, placing a new bolt into the channel, cranking the windlass mechanism to draw the heavy bowstring back. 5 seconds. That's all it took. 5 seconds from shot to ready again. Raktos stood, stones held ready. Then he threw one hard and fast directly at Daniel's chest. Daniel sidestepped. The stone whistled past, but Raktos was already throwing another and another, creating a pattern that forced Daniel to move. The fourth stone came high, aimed at his head. Daniel ducked under it. That was when Raktos charged. He came in low and fast, zigzagging as he ran. Not a straight line like before, but an irregular pattern that made him harder to track. 40 meters, then 30, then 20. Daniel fired. The bolt flew past Raktos' shoulder, missing by a hand's width. The Warlord roared in triumph and kept coming. 15 meters. Daniel was already reloading, his hands moving in the practice pattern. Crank the windlass, load the bolt. But Raktos was closing too fast. 10 meters. 8 meters. The crossbow came up. Daniel aimed not at Raktos' center mass, but at his legs. Specifically the left leg that had to bear extra weight because of the hip wound. He fired. The bolt hit Raktos' left knee dead center. The Warlord's leg buckled. His charge turned into a stumble, then a fall. He crashed to the arena floor, sliding forward on momentum before coming to a stop just 5 meters from Daniel. Purple blood leaked from his knee. The joint was damaged, maybe destroyed. Raktos tried to stand, but his left leg wouldn't support his weight anymore. He had to use his arms to push himself up, balancing awkwardly on his right leg. Daniel backpedaled, maintaining distance. He was already reloading again. His breathing was faster now, the first sign of stress showing through his calm exterior. Raktos tried to hop forward on his right leg, using his arms for balance, but it was slow and awkward. He looked more like wounded prey than a warlord. The realization showed on his face a mixture of pain, rage, and something else. Something that might have been fear.
"Stand still and die with honor,"
Raktos snarled. Daniel's response was quiet but carried across the silent arena. "I'm not here for honor. I'm here for my granddaughter." He raised the crossbow again, this time aimed at Raktos's head. The warlord froze. At this range, perhaps 3 meters, there would be no surviving that shot. The bolt would punch through his skull and keep going. He had seen what it did to armor. His bones wouldn't stop it. "Surrender," Daniel said. Not pleading. Not threatening. Just stating a fact. Raktos's pride warred with his survival instinct. He had killed 47 champions. He had never lost. He had never even come close to losing. To surrender now, injured by a human half his size using a weapon 1,000 years old, would be ultimate shame. But he would also be dead if he didn't surrender. And the dead couldn't rebuild their honor. "I am Warlord Raktos," he said through gritted teeth. "I do not—" Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger. Not pulling it yet, but the message was clear. He would shoot. "I have fought in 48 trials," Raktos continued, his voice dropping lower. "I have killed opponents from a dozen species. But you—" He looked at Daniel with new understanding. "You are not a warrior, are you? You're something else." "I'm a teacher who knows how to use the tools my ancestors made," Daniel replied. "Now surrender or I will kill you. I don't want to, but I will." Raktos looked around the arena, at the thousands of spectators, at his own people in the Draknor section, watching their greatest warrior on his knees before a human, at the council representatives who would witness this moment and remember it for generations. Then he looked at Daniel again, at the crossbow that hadn't wavered, at the calm in those eyes, the absolute certainty that this human would do exactly what he promised. "My knee is destroyed," Raktos said. "My shoulder is useless. I am bleeding from 3 wounds. I cannot win this fight," he took a deep breath, "but I can choose to live and learn from this defeat." He lowered his head. "I yield." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the arena. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the horn sounded. 3 long blasts. Combat complete. Human victory. The arena exploded in sound. Cheering, shouting, a dozen different species making noise in their own ways. The human section of the crowd was on their feet, screaming themselves hoarse. Patricia realized she was crying, tears streaming down her face as Roger hugged her and shouted something she couldn't hear over the roar. Down on the arena floor, Daniel carefully uncocked his crossbow and lowered it. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up with him. He took a step toward Raktos, then another, until he stood beside the kneeling warlord. He extended his hand. Raktos stared at it, confused. Then understanding came. A human gesture offered to a defeated enemy. With his lower left arm, the only one that didn't hurt to move, Raktos reached up and took Daniel's hand. Daniel helped pull the warlord upright, supporting him as medical teams rushed onto the floor. "You fought well," Raktos said, his voice hoarse with pain. "I underestimated humans. I will not make that error again." "And I hope I never have to do this again," Daniel replied. He looked exhausted, older than his 54 years. "I'm a teacher. This isn't who I want to be." "But it is who your species made you capable of being," Raktos said. "That is more frightening than any warrior I have faced." The medical team separated them, working on Raktos's injuries while human support staff checked Daniel for damage. He had bruises where the thrown stone hit his shoulder, and his hands were raw from working the crossbow mechanism, but otherwise he was uninjured. Ambassador Mills ran onto the arena floor, diplomatic protocol forgotten entirely. She grabbed Daniel and hugged him hard enough to make him grunt. "You did it," she said, still crying. "You actually did it." "Is the colony secure?" Daniel asked. Yes, the Draknor forces are already withdrawing." "You saved them all." Daniel nodded slowly, then his legs gave out. Mills and Roger caught him before he could fall, lowering him gently to sit on the stone floor. He wasn't injured, just completely exhausted, all the tension and fear finally releasing now that it was over. "Someone call my daughter," he said quietly. "Tell her I'm okay. Tell her Annie can come home." Above them, the Chancellor was making official announcements about the trial's conclusion, about territorial rights and treaty obligations. But Daniel wasn't listening. He was staring at his crossbow lying on the stone beside him. This weapon his ancestors had designed to kill other humans in medieval wars, now used to save human lives in a galactic arena. History had a strange sense of humor sometimes. The crowd continued cheering as medical teams carried Raktos away on a stretcher. The warlord kept his eyes on Daniel until he was out of sight, something like respect showing in his expression. The galaxy had learned something today. Humanity wasn't the weakest species just because they were smaller. They were survivors who had learned to fight things bigger and stronger than themselves long before they reached the stars, and they remembered those lessons very, very well. News of the trial's outcome spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Quantum communication networks carried footage of the combat to every inhabited system within hours. Daniel's victory became the most viewed event in galactic history, surpassing even the founding of the Council itself. On Earth, celebrations erupted in cities across the planet. People who had never heard of Frontier World 7 suddenly knew every detail of the colony, the challenge, and the teacher who had saved 12,000 lives with a weapon from humanity's past. Daniel's university was flooded with interview requests. His daughter's home was surrounded by news crews hoping for family reactions, but Daniel himself was still on the neutral moon, sitting in a medical bay while doctors checked him over one more time. Patricia sat with him, working through the mountain of diplomatic paperwork that the trial's conclusion had generated. The Draknor Empire has formally ceded all claims to Frontier World 7, she said, reading from her tablet. Their forces began withdrawal 17 minutes after the trial ended. Complete evacuation should be finished within 48 hours. Daniel nodded, barely listening. His hand still shook slightly, residual adrenaline working through his system. A doctor had given him something for the shaking, but it wasn't helping much. You're going to be famous, Patricia continued. The Council wants to honor you with a citation. Earth Command wants to give you a medal. There are at least 50 news organizations requesting exclusive interviews. I don't want any of that, Daniel said quietly. I just want to go home. Patricia set down her tablet and looked at him. Really looked at him. Not as an ambassador viewing a champion, but as one human seeing another. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the way his shoulders slumped, the tremor in his hands that wouldn't stop. You're not okay, she said. No, Daniel agreed. I'm not. I just killed someone. Nearly killed him anyway, and 40,000 people cheered while I did it. You saved 12,000 lives, and I know. That's the only thing keeping me together right now. He rubbed his face with both hands. I spent 30 years teaching people about medieval warfare, showing them how swords worked, how armor protected soldiers, how battles were fought. But it was always historical, academic. I never thought I would actually have to hurt someone with those techniques. The door opened and Roger entered looking nervous. Ambassador, the Draknor delegation has requested a meeting. Warlord Raktos wants to speak with Professor Cross. Daniel looked up sharply. Is that allowed? The trial is over, Patricia said. You're no longer bound by the non-contact rules, but you don't have to meet with him if you don't want to. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then nodded. I'll meet him. Give me 10 minutes. 20 minutes later, Daniel entered a conference room in the station's diplomatic section. Raktos was already there, sitting in a reinforced chair designed for his size. His right arm was in a complex brace that immobilized the shoulder. His left leg was wrapped in medical foam and supported by a frame. He looked diminished somehow, not as terrifying as he had seemed in the arena. Two of his advisors stood against the wall, but Raktos waved them out when Daniel entered. They left reluctantly, leaving the human and the warlord alone. Please sit, Raktos said, gesturing to a chair with his lower left arm. Daniel sat, keeping the table between them. He studied Raktos carefully, looking for signs of aggression or deception. But the warlord just looked tired. I wanted to speak with you before you left, Raktos began, to understand what happened in that arena. You lost, Daniel said simply. Yes, I lost. I have spent the last hours trying to understand how. Raktos shifted in his chair, wincing at the movement. I am larger, stronger, faster than you. My natural weapons are superior to any tool you could hold. By every measure, I should have killed you in the first 30 seconds. But you didn't factor in range, Daniel said, or patience, or the fact that humans have been killing things bigger than us for hundreds of thousands of years. Your weapon, that crossbow, it is truly 1,000 years old. The design is. The specific one I built used modern materials, but the basic principles haven't changed since the 14th century. Humans made crossbows because we needed to fight opponents wearing full metal armor. Knights on horseback, soldiers behind shields, enemy warriors who trained their entire lives for combat. Daniel leaned back in his chair. We were never the biggest or strongest species on our planet. We're not the fastest or most dangerous, but we learned to kill things that were. Raktos was silent for a long moment. I have been a warrior my entire life, trained from childhood in combat. I thought I understood what it meant to fight. And now I understand that combat is not about strength or honor or glory. It is about survival, and your species understands survival better than mine does. Raktos met Daniel's eyes. I apologize for my arrogance. I dismissed humanity as weak. I was wrong. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. An apology from a warlord who had tried to kill him hours ago seemed surreal. What happens now? Daniel asked. To you, I mean. Will your people punish you for losing? Perhaps. Perhaps not. I am still warlord, and I still command respect through past victories. But I will be remembered as the warrior who lost to a human teacher. Raktos made a sound that might have been a laugh. There are worse legacies. I learned something valuable today. What's that? That there are many ways to be strong. The Drachner have always valued physical power above all else, but you showed me a different kind of strength. Preparation. Knowledge. Using your mind to overcome disadvantages. Raktos paused. I would like to learn more about human combat history. If you would be willing to teach me. Daniel blinked in surprise. You want me to teach you? I want to understand what makes humans dangerous. Not so I can defeat you in future combat, but so my people can learn from you. We have been warriors for so long that we forgot there are other forms of strength. Raktos gestured at his injuries. This defeat taught me more than 47 victories ever did. Daniel thought about it. Teaching a warlord about human military history seemed strange, but maybe that was exactly what the galaxy needed. Understanding instead of conflict. I'll think about it, Daniel said, after I spend some time recovering and seeing my family. That is fair. Raktos stood slowly, balancing on his good leg. Thank you for sparing my life, Professor Cross. You could have killed me. You had the right, but you showed mercy. I didn't come here to kill anyone, Daniel said, standing as well. I came here to save my granddaughter and the other colonists. You surrendering accomplished that. They stood awkwardly for a moment, former opponents not sure how to end this conversation. Finally, Raktos extended his lower left arm in the human handshake gesture Daniel had taught him on the arena floor. Daniel shook it. May we meet again under better circumstances, Raktos said. I hope so, Daniel replied. After Raktos left, Patricia found Daniel still sitting in the conference room, staring at nothing. That was unexpected, she said. Everything about the last week has been unexpected, Daniel replied. I'm a history teacher. I should be grading papers and preparing lectures, not fighting alien warlords in ancient arenas. But you did fight, and you won. And you've changed how the entire galaxy views humanity. Patricia sat down beside him. The Council has been talking. Multiple species want to establish cultural exchange programs with Earth. They want to study our history, understand how we developed our combat techniques. Some of them are actually afraid of us now. Afraid? You proved that humans are dangerous in ways they hadn't considered. We're not dangerous because we have the best technology or the strongest bodies. We're dangerous because we remember, we learn, we adapt, and we never forget how to survive. Daniel thought about his ancestors, humans who had lived in caves and hunted mammoths with stone-tipped spears, humans who had built castles and fought with swords and crossbows, humans who had survived ice ages and plagues and wars and had still reached the stars. Maybe that's not a bad thing for them to learn, he said finally. 3 days later, Daniel boarded a transport headed back to Earth. The crossbow went with him, carefully packed in its case. The quiver of bolts, minus the ones that had struck Raktos, was packed beside it. Patricia came to see him off along with Roger and a small group of human station personnel who wanted to thank him personally. Stay safe, Patricia said, hugging him. And if you ever need anything at all, you call me. I will. Thank you for everything, Ambassador. Thank you for saving 12,000 people, including my niece, who happens to live in the colony with her family. Daniel stared at her. You had family there? You never mentioned that. Didn't want to make it about me. This was always about the colonists, not about personal stakes. She smiled. But yes, my niece sends her thanks, along with her husband and 2 kids. The transport's departure warning chimed. Daniel picked up his case and backpack. Go home, Daniel, Patricia said. See your family. Try to rest. I will. Or at least I'll try. The journey back to Earth took 4 days. Daniel spent most of it sleeping, his body finally crashing after a week of stress and terror. When he wasn't sleeping, he watched footage of the trial that news networks had compiled, seeing the fight from angles he hadn't experienced during the actual combat. It was strange watching himself move through the arena, staying calm while a 9-foot warlord charged at him. He looked smaller on camera than he felt in his own memory. More vulnerable, but also more focused, more certain of what he was doing. The scholarly Yithran who had watched the trial had published a paper analyzing the combat from a historical perspective. Daniel read it during the journey, fascinated by how the alien scholar had connected his tactics to specific medieval battles and siege warfare techniques. The human demonstrated principles consistent with longbow archer defensive doctrine from the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, the paper noted. Maintaining optimal range, forcing enemy into disadvantageous terrain, using projectile superiority to control engagement distance. The hand-thrust bolt technique showed improvisation, consistent with medieval knights who lost primary weapons and adapted tools to immediate combat needs. Someone from another species had studied his culture's history and understood what he had done. That felt important somehow. Earth appeared in the viewport on the 4th day. Blue and white and green, looking exactly the same as it always had, despite everything that had happened. Daniel pressed his hand against the window, feeling an overwhelming relief at seeing home. The transport landed at a diplomatic facility outside Geneva. Daniel had expected a quiet arrival, maybe a few official debriefings before he could finally go home to his daughter's house in Colorado. Instead, he found 500 people waiting at the landing pad. Reporters, government officials, military officers, and citizens who had traveled just to see the man who had saved Frontier World 7. They cheered when he emerged from the transport, and Daniel felt his face flush with embarrassment. A military honor guard escorted him through the crowd to a waiting vehicle. An official from Earth Command shook his hand and thanked him for his service. A representative from the university offered him any position he wanted, with any salary he named. Daniel politely declined everything and asked to be taken to the nearest commercial terminal, where he could catch a flight to Colorado. They agreed, but only after he endured an hour-long press conference where he answered questions about the trial, about his preparation, about what he felt when he faced Raktos in the arena. I felt terrified, Daniel admitted to one reporter. I'm not a soldier. I'm not brave. I was just a grandfather trying to save his granddaughter. But you fought anyway, the reporter said. Yes, because that's what humans do. We fight for our families even when we're afraid. That quote appeared on news feeds across Earth within minutes. Finally, blessedly, they let him go. Daniel caught a flight to Denver, then took a taxi to his daughter's house in the suburbs. He had called ahead to let her know he was coming, but he hadn't told her exactly when he would arrive. The taxi pulled up to a modest house with a small yard. Daniel paid the driver, grabbed his case and backpack, and walked to the front door. It opened before he could knock. His daughter Sophie stood there, tears already streaming down her face. "Dad," she said, and pulled him into a hug that nearly knocked him over. "I'm okay," Daniel said, hugging her back. "I'm okay, Sophie. You could have died. You almost died. I watched the footage and I thought..." She couldn't finish, just held him tighter. Over her shoulder, Daniel saw his granddaughter Annie standing in the hallway. She was 7 years old with her mother's dark hair and her grandfather's eyes. She held a stuffed dinosaur in one hand. "Grandpa?" she said in a small voice. Daniel gently released Sophie and knelt down to Annie's level. "Hey there, rock collector. I heard you get to come home now." Annie ran to him and wrapped her arms around his neck. "Everyone says you're a hero. They say you fought an alien monster to save us." "He wasn't a monster," Daniel said, holding her close. "Just someone who made a bad choice. And yes, I fought him. But I'm not a hero, Annie. I'm just your grandpa. Can I see your weapon? The crossbow?" Daniel looked at Sophie, who nodded reluctantly. He opened the case and carefully lifted out the crossbow. It looked innocent now, just wood and metal and cable. Hard to believe this thing had brought down a warlord. "This is what medieval soldiers used," Daniel explained. "Like I taught you about in stories, remember?" Annie reached out tentatively and touched the wood. "You use this for real?" "Yes. And now I'm going to hang it on my wall at home and hopefully never use it again." They went inside, and Sophie made dinner while Daniel told them carefully edited versions of what had happened. He left out the worst parts, the moments of genuine terror, the sight of purple blood on arena stone. Annie didn't need those nightmares. After dinner, they sat in the living room and Annie showed Daniel rocks she had collected from the stream near their farm on Frontier World 7. Each one had a story, a memory of where she found it and what she had been thinking about that day. "I was scared we'd have to leave," Annie admitted, holding a smooth gray stone. "I didn't want to leave my rocks behind." "You don't have to leave them," Daniel said. "You get to go back home and collect more rocks. As many as you want." Annie smiled and hugged the stone to her chest. Later, after Annie was in bed, Daniel sat with Sophie on the back porch. The Colorado night was cool and clear, stars visible above the suburban glow. "Are you really okay?" Sophie asked quietly. "I don't know yet," Daniel admitted. "I think so, maybe. Ask me again in a few months. The news says you're going to be famous, that you changed how aliens see humanity. I just did what I had to do to protect family." Sophie took his hand. "Thank you for saving her. Thank you for saving all of them." They sat in comfortable silence, father and daughter, watching the stars where somewhere among them was a colony that would continue to exist. Because a teacher remembered how to use an old weapon, Daniel thought about Rakdos recovering from his wounds and reconsidering everything he thought he knew about strength. He thought about Patricia, probably still buried in diplomatic paperwork. He thought about the galaxy watching footage of their fight and learning that humans were more than they appeared. But mostly he thought about Annie sleeping safely inside, her rocks arranged carefully on her bedside table, dreaming of home on a world that was still hers. That was worth everything. 6 months passed before the full impact of the trial became clear. Daniel returned to teaching at his university, though his classes were now filled to capacity with students who wanted to learn from the man who had defeated a warlord with medieval weapons. He taught the same lessons he always had, showing students how historical combat techniques worked and why they had been developed. But now his classes included alien students. 3 Ythrans, 2 Kelmar, and even 1 young Draknor attended his lectures on medieval European warfare. They sat among human students taking notes and asking questions about tactics and weapon design. The Draknor student, whose name translated roughly as Swiftblade, was particularly interested in crossbow mechanics. "Professor Cross, your species developed this weapon specifically to counter armored opponents," Swiftblade asked during one lecture. "That's right," Daniel confirmed. Medieval knights wore full plate armor that could deflect sword strikes and even arrows from traditional bows. So weapon makers developed crossbows with enough power to punch through steel plate. It was an arms race, essentially. Better armor led to better weapons, which led to better armor, and so on. But the crossbow won, Swiftblade observed. Armor eventually became obsolete. Yes, once firearms were developed, personal armor couldn't keep up. The cost of armor that could stop bullets became prohibitive, so warfare shifted to other defensive strategies. A human student raised her hand. "Professor, is it true that the Draknor military is now studying human combat history?" Daniel glanced at Swiftblade, who nodded permission to share. "Yes. After the trial, Warlord Rakdos initiated a cultural exchange program. Draknor warriors are studying how humans developed combat techniques to overcome physical disadvantages." "Is that wise?" another student asked. "Teaching potential enemies our strategies?" "If they're studying our strategies, they're not our enemies anymore," Daniel replied. "They're students, and understanding how we think is the first step toward cooperation instead of conflict." After class, Swiftblade approached Daniel's desk. "Professor, Warlord Rakdos asked me to deliver a message. He has recovered from his injuries and wishes to know if you would consider visiting the Draknor homeworld to lecture at our military academy." Daniel had been expecting this. Rakdos had sent several messages over the past months, each one more cordial than the last. The warlord seemed genuinely interested in learning from human history. "I'll think about it," Daniel said. "I'm not sure I'm ready to visit Draknor space yet." "I understand." The warlord said to tell you there is no pressure. The invitation remains open whenever you are ready. Swiftblade hesitated. "Professor, may I ask a personal question?" "Go ahead. Were you truly afraid during the trial?" "The footage shows you very calm." Daniel smiled slightly. "I was terrified every single second. But fear doesn't mean you can't function. It just means you have to work through it." Swiftblade absorbed this. Draknor culture teaches that fear is weakness, that warriors should be fearless. Then your culture is wrong, Daniel said bluntly. Fear is what kept my ancestors alive long enough to have children. It's a survival mechanism. The trick is not eliminating fear, but learning to act despite it. The young Draknor student considered this, then bowed in the Draknor gesture of respect. Thank you, Professor. I will remember that lesson. Later that week, Daniel received a visitor at his campus office. Ambassador Patricia Mills had traveled to Colorado to discuss developments in galactic politics. The trial changed everything, she said, sitting across from Daniel's desk. 5 species have requested formal military exchange programs with Earth. The Council created a new position, studying the combat histories of member species. And territorial disputes are being resolved through diplomacy much more quickly, because nobody wants to risk a trial by champion anymore. They're afraid we'll send someone like me again, Daniel said. Exactly. You proved that humanity can punch above our weight class, literally. Other species are reevaluating their assumptions about us. Patricia leaned forward. Which brings me to why I'm here. The Council wants you to serve as cultural military historian for humanity. Document our combat traditions. Advise on trial by champion protocols. Help other species understand human warfare development. Daniel shook his head. I'm a teacher, Patricia. I want to stay here with my family and my students. You could do both. The position is advisory, not full-time. A few lectures per year. Maybe some consultation work. You'd be helping prevent future conflicts by promoting understanding. I'll think about it, Daniel said, his standard response to any request that took him away from home. Patricia smiled. That's all I ask. Think about it. She left a datapad with information about the position, but Daniel set it aside. He had enough to deal with managing his expanded class sizes and mentoring alien students who wanted to understand human history. That evening, he video-called Sophie and Annie on Frontier World 7. The colony had grown in the 6 months since the trial. New families arriving to help build the settlement. Annie appeared on screen wearing a shirt covered in dinosaur pictures, her collection of rocks visible on shelves behind her. Grandpa, guess what I found today? Annie held up a reddish stone with crystal formations. It's got sparkly bits inside. That's beautiful, rock collector. What are you going to name it? Annie thought seriously. Professor Stone, Daniel laughed. That's perfect. Sophie appeared in frame, looking tired but happy. Dad, I wanted to thank you again for what you did. Every day here, watching Annie play with her friends, I'm reminded that this wouldn't be possible without you. Just doing what any grandfather would do, Daniel said. No. Most grandfathers don't face alien warlords in combat. What you did was extraordinary. After the call ended, Daniel sat alone in his living room, staring at the crossbow mounted on his wall. He had cleaned it thoroughly after returning to Earth, removing every trace of the arena from its surface. Now it looked like what it was, a carefully crafted historical reproduction, a teaching tool, a piece of human heritage. But he knew what it was capable of. He had felt the power in its release, seen what it could do to living flesh. That knowledge would never completely leave him. His tablet chimed with a new message. Daniel opened it and found a video file from an unfamiliar sender. He almost deleted it, but something made him play it instead. The video showed Warlord Raktos standing in what appeared to be a Draknor training facility. His shoulder had healed, though he still favored it slightly. His knee was supported by a brace, but he moved without limping. Professor Cross, Raktos began, speaking directly to the camera. I wanted you to see what your victory has inspired among my people. Watch. The camera panned to show young Draknor warriors training, but they weren't practicing with traditional Draknor weapons. They were learning to use projectile weapons, not crossbows exactly, but similar in principle. Weapons designed to strike from distance, to use mechanical advantage rather than pure strength. You taught us that combat is not only about physical power. Raktos's voice continued over the training footage. My people are learning new ways to fight, new strategies that emphasize intelligence and preparation over brute force. We are becoming better warriors because we learned from you. The camera returned to Raktos. I hope you will visit someday, not as a champion facing an opponent, but as a teacher sharing knowledge with students. Until then, know that the defeat you gave me was the greatest gift I have received. It opened my eyes to possibilities I never imagined. The video ended. Daniel sat quietly, processing what he had seen. His victory had ripple effects he never anticipated. not just saving one colony but changing how an entire warrior species approached combat. The next day, Daniel submitted his acceptance letter for the Council's cultural military historian position. Not because he wanted fame or influence, but because he realized his knowledge could prevent future conflicts. If sharing human history helped other species understand cooperation instead of conquest, that was worth the time away from home. 3 months later, Daniel stood at a podium in the Galactic Council chambers, speaking to representatives from 40 species about the development of medieval siege warfare. His lecture covered trebuchets, battering rams, and siege towers, all weapons designed to overcome defensive advantages through engineering and patience rather than direct assault. The audience listened with rapt attention, taking notes and asking questions. These weren't warriors seeking combat secrets, but diplomats and scholars trying to understand how humanity had resolved conflicts throughout its history. After the lecture, the Ythran Chancellor approached. "Professor Cross, that was enlightening. I particularly appreciated your analysis of how siege warfare encouraged negotiation and surrender terms rather than total destruction." Medieval sieges could last months, Daniel explained. Both sides usually preferred negotiated surrender to costly assault. It was practical. Defenders got to live, attackers saved resources, and conflicts ended with minimal casualties. A lesson many species could learn, the Chancellor observed. Violence as last resort rather than first option. That evening, Daniel had dinner with Ambassador Mills and several other Earth diplomatic staff. They celebrated the success of his lecture and discussed future opportunities for cultural exchange. "You've become quite famous, you know," Patricia said. "The teacher who defeated a warlord and then taught the galaxy about medieval warfare. There are scholars writing entire papers about you." "I'm just doing what I always did," Daniel protested, "teaching history. But now people are listening in ways they never did before. You have credibility that comes from proving your knowledge in the most literal way possible." Daniel thought about that. His entire academic career, he had taught students about historical warfare, trying to make them understand why these techniques mattered and what they revealed about human nature. Now, because he had been forced to use those techniques to save lives, people across the galaxy were paying attention. A week later, Daniel finally accepted Raktos' invitation and traveled to the Draknor homeworld. The planet was beautiful in a harsh way. Red rock landscapes under an orange-tinted sky, massive mountains that made Earth's peaks look small, heavy gravity that made Daniel feel like he weighed twice as much. Raktos met him at the spaceport, walking without the knee brace now, though Daniel noticed a slight limp remained. The Warlord wore formal civilian clothing instead of armor. "Professor Cross, welcome to Draknor Prime," Raktos said, bowing in the human style Daniel had taught him. "Thank you for inviting me," Daniel replied, returning the bow. Over the next 3 days, Daniel lectured at the Draknor Military Academy about human combat history. He covered everything from ancient phalanx formations to medieval night tactics to modern strategic theory. The Draknor students listened intently, asking sophisticated questions about doctrine and strategy. On the final day, Raktos took Daniel to a memorial garden where statues honored great Draknor warriors throughout history. At the center stood a new statue, Raktos himself kneeling with head bowed. "This commemorates my defeat," Raktos explained. "In Draknor culture, we traditionally honor only victories, but I argued that my loss to you taught us more than 100 victories could have." The Council of Warlords agreed to memorialize it. Daniel studied the statue. "What does the inscription say?" "Strength takes many forms. Wisdom recognizes them all." Raktos stood beside Daniel, looking at his own stone image. "That is what you taught me, Professor. My entire life, I believed combat was about physical dominance. You showed me it was about using whatever advantages you possess, no matter how unconventional others might find them. Your people have a saying about that in human culture," Daniel said. "Don't fight fair, fight to win." Raktos laughed, a deep rumbling sound. "Yes, I understand that now." They walked through the garden together, former opponents, now something approaching friends. Daniel told stories about his granddaughter and her rock collection. Raktos shared memories of his own family, children who looked at him differently after his defeat, not with less respect, but with more complexity. "I am glad you did not kill me," Raktos said as they concluded the tour. "Living with defeat has taught me more than dying with honor would have." Daniel returned to Earth a week later, exhausted but satisfied with the visit. He had accomplished something he never expected, turning an enemy into an ally through understanding rather than continued conflict. Annie video called him the day he got back. "Grandpa, Mom says you visited the alien warrior guy. Was he scary?" "Not anymore," Daniel said honestly. "Now he's just someone I know who happens to be 9 feet tall and has 4 arms." "Did you teach him about rocks?" "No, I taught him about medieval warfare. But maybe next time I'll teach him about geology instead." Annie giggled. That would be funny. A big warrior learning about rocks. After the call, Daniel sat in his living room with a cup of tea, looking at the crossbow on the wall. 6 months ago, it had been a weapon that saved 12,000 lives and changed galactic politics. Now it was returning to what it should be, a teaching tool, a historical artifact, a reminder of human ingenuity. His tablet chimed with a message from the university. Next semester's enrollment was at maximum capacity, with a waiting list of students, human and alien, who wanted to take his classes. He had requests for guest lectures from 7 different universities across 3 star systems. The council wanted him to consult on a new treaty regarding acceptable weapons in trials. Daniel smiled and set the tablet aside. He would deal with all that tomorrow. Tonight, he was just a grandfather who missed his family, and a teacher who needed to prepare next week's lecture on the development of armor throughout human history. The crossbow hung on the wall, silent and still. Just an arrangement of wood, metal, and cable, but also a symbol of what humans could accomplish when they remembered where they came from and used their history to face the future. Old rules apply, Daniel thought. And that was exactly as it should be. Somewhere in space, on Frontier World 7, a 7-year-old girl added a new rock to her collection and thought about her grandfather who had saved her home with a weapon from storybooks. She picked up the rock she had named Professor Stone and placed it in the honored spot on her shelf, right where she could see it every morning. And across the galaxy, species who had never thought about human history began studying it, learning about a people who survived by being clever, adaptable, and unwilling to surrender no matter the odds. The teacher had taught them all a lesson they would never forget. Strength came in many forms, and humanity's strength was memory, knowledge, and the will to protect what mattered most. One grandfather, one weapon, one moment of courage had changed everything, and the ripples would continue spreading for generations to come.